So yesterday I was riding down on the Amtrak train from Philadelphia to Washington, and I think maybe some of my fellow passengers might have been startled by this woman kind of making these yippee sort of sounds. What they didn't know was that I was reading the materials that I had been provided as background from the presentations today. So why was I excited? Well, it may be self-evident, but you might need to understand as background my reaction in the context of a couple of things that with my colleagues Diane Horm and Pam Winton I've written lately on higher education. One was a chapter for Bob et al.'s Handbook of Early Childhood Education, and more recently we kind of reworked and drilled down to some issues like infant toddler and math and so on, forgive me for my ignorance, but also circling around higher education issues and the early childhood field. And in the most recent article that appeared this month in the Journal of Early Childhood Teacher Education, we started out by saying this special issue asks whether, for whom, and in what ways early childhood teacher education matters. We see this, my colleagues and I said, as a critically important question, but one that the field is not yet in a good position to answer. And we still are not in that position, but thanks to the work of my colleagues here, I think that situation seems to be changing. In that article and in the chapter that preceded it, we situated higher education within the broader professional development system, which I think often that connection is neglected. And we noted the number of external influences, policies, resources that constrain or occasionally facilitate the higher education system. We also noted that the impact of higher education on graduates' practices is, in theory at least, influenced by things like the characteristics and resources of individual learners. Some of this connects with what Marcy has talked about, as well as by the workplace conditions and supports that they receive. This is not a disconnected set of pieces, but it is a system in which the pieces are connected. And, of course, the pathway from those practices of the graduates of higher education programs to improve child and family outcomes is a pathway that's also challenging to think about and to trace. And as everybody seems to be saying, it's complicated. So in looking at the research on early childhood teacher education, my colleagues and I have noted what many of you already know. First, few of those kinds of relationships that I just noted and more have been studied at all. Second, little has been known in the past about variations in higher education program features. What are these programs like? Who do they serve? Et cetera, et cetera. Much of that knowledge that has been gathered in the past either was not sufficiently detailed or is now outdated. Third, little is known about how variations in features of higher education programs may affect the practices of graduates, let alone child outcomes. And finally, although there's a lot of published research about higher education and early childhood, if you look at early childhood focused journals, most of that research is descriptive. It uses small, non-representative samples. It focuses on case studies of one program, those kinds of things. So although those generalizations, unfortunately, still pertain to a great extent, again, a big yippee for the promising directions that are being taken here. Thanks to the work of Marcy, Karen and Catherine, and Kathy, we have, from Marcy and her colleagues, a tool that I'm so excited about, and you probably are too, that looks like it can yield essential information about the characteristics of these programs, information that can be used by states to identify their system strengths and gaps and, one hopes, areas for targeted improvement efforts. From Catherine and Karen, we have new data on student teaching that helps to fill in some of the blanks about the all-important practice component of teacher education, harking back to Marty's call for the integration of knowledge-focused and practice-focused approaches. And with many of you are connected with NCATE, the National Council for the Accreditation of Teacher Education, they've recently called in a big report for a radical reform of teacher education in general, focusing much much more on a clinically or practice-based model. And the insights from the work that Catherine and Karen have been doing is timely, but also, as we saw in a number of ways, troubling. And it illustrates the lack of alignment with other things going on in states like the QRIS assessments. And from Kathy, we have more evidence, as in the case of Missouri, of some lack of association between levels of teachers' higher education and classroom quality scores using the Eckers. And the associations are not robust. You can pick out some associations, but they continue to leave open the question of what competencies may underlie the positive associations that are there. Promising, too, from Kathy's presentation, though, are state examples of efforts to develop common program standards in higher education and to align those with teacher competencies and assessment and accountability systems. I think those kinds of efforts in Missouri and elsewhere will help to strengthen the linkages between the often disconnected higher education system, which, let's face it, is professional development, and the broader professional development and early childhood education system within which it's situated. But here's the rub. With limited exceptions, we don't yet know how to make this happen, how to make the kind of changes in higher education content and pedagogy that would strengthen the linkages from students' experiences in those programs to their practices and in turn to child outcomes. I'm prompted by the presentations to raise a few questions about some higher education issues that urgently need, in my opinion, joint attention from researchers and policymakers, building from promising work such as we've just heard. First question, how can the capacity of higher education faculty be strengthened, and how would we know that those interventions were effective? Those of you who know me know that this is a hobby horse that I've been riding for quite a while. I think in all of these presentations, the need for faculty development is implicit throughout. Approaches have been tried in different contexts, different projects. Summer institutes, provision of course modules, entire pre-designed courses, online resources, but almost nothing has been done to evaluate those few initiatives in relation to faculty knowledge, beliefs, and pedagogy. One thing that I thought about was, are there things that we can learn from the larger early childhood professional development literature that can help us think about professional development for faculty? This is professional development, and maybe some of those features of effective professional development can be applied in that context. Second, how can we best assess the quality of higher education programs and what policy levers may most effectively promote quality in the higher education system? Kathy noted that her state's efforts to align higher education content with state standards are ongoing and pretty robust. But I think it's still an empirical question whether those kinds of reforms will indeed be reflective or have an impact on enhanced competence of graduates and better outcomes for children. It's also valuable to have data on courses and credits in various content areas, but it seems to me, and I think Catherine sort of previewed this in her introduction to the session, compared to what we know about in-service professional development, higher education or pre-service is still a great big black box. So can we look even more closely at the extent to which some of, again, the documented features of effective professional development, I'm thinking of report from Marty and her colleagues, are they embedded in higher education coursework and field experiences? And finally, and you see I'm talking very fast, following from that, and some of the discussion this morning, the presentations have brought to my mind the question of trade-offs in teacher preparation between breadth, coverage of content, and depth. The results of studies such as Marcy's survey, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the right name for it, and the work that Catherine and Karen have done often lead to recommendations to add more. Right? We need more coursework on infants and toddlers. We need more coursework on leadership. We need more hours and practica and student teaching and adult learning, diversity, et cetera. I'm not saying that to minimize that those are important areas, but that add more tendency is exacerbated when we have, as Jacqueline referred to at lunchtime, the vision, and I was just at a meeting with a number of you in Philadelphia, the vision of a birth to grade 3 system is taking hold in many states, with teacher licensure increasingly spanning that dauntingly wide developmental age. I mean, you can talk about K6 or whatever, but developmentally, the transitions and the differences are really challenging there. So people working in the field are seeing teachers who are struggling with that kind of license to teach grade 2 or grade 3 reading and so on, coming out of, again, this is the risk of the mile-wide and inch-deep professional development. So evidently, and I'll take a deep breath and finish, the presentations have really stimulated my thinking, and I'm sure your thinking as well, about the best way to move forward in higher education research and policy with the goal for better outcomes for all of our children. Thanks very much.